We're glad you're here today and look forward to studying together. As always, you can open up in your Bibles, please, to Isaiah 11. We're going to look in Isaiah chapter 11 today. We'll read some of that together here in just a moment and discuss. We will summarize a little bit of what's happened in chapter 10 and then get to the meat of chapter 11. Yet another chapter, yet another passage we'll see coming up that is quoted in the New Testament, that is used to refer to and sort of explain Jesus and who he is. We've already seen that happen several times by now, really. In each of the last three classes, we've observed some time that Isaiah is pointing forward to something very specific. He might have something near in mind as well, but he also has his eyes to the future. He has his eyes to the ultimate Son of David. And that's where we'll find ourselves going this morning here in Isaiah chapter 11. Again, glad you're here. Looking forward to studying. Before we get further into Isaiah 11, we'll ask Jimmy Foster, if you would, lead us in a prayer this morning. Amen. Thank you. We saw in the second half of chapter 9, and it continued into the first 4 verses of chapter 10, sort of a song, really a hymn, a psalm of sorts, that is pronouncing woe and is outlining many of Judah's missteps and laying some of the charges against them. With the refrain of that song at each of the 4 stanzas, for all this, the Lord's anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. That being stretched out not to soothe or to offer something good, but stretched out in judgment, stretched out to punish. So we saw that diving into very negative territory, I guess. Beginning with verse 5 in chapter 10, things shift once again as we're kind of getting comfortable with the discomfort of Isaiah in this rapid change back and forth between judgment and blessing or judgment and promise or whatever it might be. But in verse 5, he redirects his attention to Assyria, to the here and now enemy that the people were facing. Their great threat, the bad guy, the nemesis is Assyria. And God tells them, I'm going to punish them. I'm going to take care of them. They are wicked. They are evil almost beyond accounting, almost beyond belief, and they'll be punished. I'm going to destroy them as well. I will perform this work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem and punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria. That's chapter 10 and verse 12. So then he goes on to describe this process and leads up to a kind of crescendo after comforting his people in verse 24 by saying, don't be afraid of the Assyrian. He is going to strike you. There will be harm done. He likens it to Egypt, the rod, the burden of Egypt, which was a long period of suffering for the descendants of Joseph and of Israel, but ultimately led to their deliverance. And ultimately they're comforted and they're given relief and all those sorts of things. And so he likens it to that in some sense. But he says that'll cease and that will end. And so he kind of starts describing how that will play out. Beginning in verse 28 are all these pictures of sort of Israel being on the run and being threatened. And they keep seeing the Assyrian troops show up at different places, and the Assyrians kind of win battles at different points. And we're having to flee and to evacuate different parts, and we're all sort of being cornered into this one place. And it culminates in verse 32 with the Assyrian shaking his fist at the mount of the daughter of Zion, the hill of Jerusalem. Here he is threatening the gates of the holy city itself. He's right here. He's the impending danger. Nothing else can stop him. Look how far he's come. And yet, last two verses of chapter 10, behold, the Lord of hosts, will lop off the bough with terror. Those of high stature will be hewn down, and the haughty will be humbled. He will cut down the thickets of the forest with iron, and Lebanon will fall by the mighty one. In context, I think this is talking about the king of Assyria. This is talking about the enemy. He's the haughty one. He's the arrogant one. That's what he's constantly talked about as the primary sin of Assyria, at least in chapter 10. And so he says he's going to get that far, but he's not going to get any farther. And that's where I cut him off. That's where the tree gets chopped down. And so it is in that context that chapter 11 begins, really picking up with the same imagery. He has just talked about cutting down this great tree, lopping off that mighty Assyria, and now there will come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, a branch shall grow out of its roots, a stem or a stump. So he's looking at now kind of Assyria has been used as fertilizer almost for this new great thing that is going to ultimately grow. So the shift, I guess, from chapter 10 to chapter 11 is stark and informative. The greatest human or worldly kingdom that they're worried about, Assyria, has threatened God's people, but ultimately failed in their goal of conquest. And so they're lopped off or hewn down, they're cut down, and now the divine kingdom, the godly kingdom, the line of Jesse, will grow and spread. The kingdom of man is reduced to nothing so that the true kingdom can shoot forth. That's ultimately what we're looking at. Let's read these first 9 verses together, at least. Isaiah chapter 11. Read with me, please, verses 1 through 9. There shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. His delight is in the fear of the Lord, and he shall not judge by the sight of his eyes, nor decide by the hearing of his ears, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his loins, and faithfulness the belt of his waist. The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze. Their young ones shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play by the cobra's hole, and the weaned child shall put his hand in the viper's den. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Hopefully, in these early chapters of Isaiah, I've adequately stressed a key theme that really develops throughout the book, but hopefully I've called your attention enough to it already in these first 11 or so chapters, which is God's limitless capacity to surprise and to have the unexpected, the unbelievable kind of to become reality. And we're seeing that here in these opening verses of chapter 11. All of his greatest works take place in the context of deepest despair. That's when he's going to do something great. That's when he's going to do something unimaginable, is when you have a mighty, terrifying enemy, when the enemy's tree seems to have grown up just impossibly big and impossibly strong. That's when he's going to cut it down, and that's when he's going to remove it, and that's when he's going to start something new of his own that is infused with his might and with his spirit. He speaks of things in terms that are hard for us to imagine or even to believe. We'll see here verses 6 through 9. I mean, he's painting a picture that to us is, Well, it's unnatural. I mean, it doesn't even compute outside of Disney movies. I mean, outside of The Lion King or something like that, you don't see animals getting along like this. This doesn't go with the natural order of things. It just isn't something we can even picture or envision happening. Isaiah, though, invites your imagination to run wild with the limitless possibilities when trust in God and commitment to His righteousness are the rules of life. These are the kinds of things that develop. When God's rule is the rule, when He is king, when it is His holy mountain that is being discussed, all those things are available. All those impossible things are possible. All of the despair can be wiped away in a moment and turned into rejoicing. But it is this constant sense of reversal and renewal and the unexpected happening that Isaiah assaults us with in these early chapters. Every time we see some great blessing, every time we see some incomparable picture of peace and blessedness, it always comes about after the picture of greatest darkness has been painted for us. So again, hopefully we're kind of appreciating that as we go and take a lesson away from that in our lives. It's not saying that the best thing will always happen and, you just wish hard enough and your worst day is going to lead to your best day and everything's just always going to turn out roses in the end. That is not the point. But to have faith in God, which He's been inviting, to have that trust in God that He has shown as the key to everything, is to recognize His capacity to make all things new, His capacity to make all things good again, to reverse evil, to undo the wickedness of man, to set to right all things, to set to order and to bring balance into the cosmos itself. And we trust that He can and will perform this. So He begins by describing for us one who will come forth, and He is talking about a person. It becomes clear, especially after verse 1. But He's described, first of all, in these, again, kind of agricultural or arboreal terms. You have a rod from the stem or from the stump of Jesse, and a branch growing out of his root. What's under discussion here? If we're dealing with a stem of Jesse and coming out of that, what's the reference there? Who's Jesse? David's father. Okay. Significance then to this imagery. I mean, why are we talking about him in this way? Ian. Okay. Okay. Any attachment that brings us back to the line of David and that lineage growing and prospering and remaining, even through difficulty, even through challenge, even as we've talked about, through these kind of troughs of seemingly unspannable distance and depth. Even throughout all of this, God has made these promises to David, and so this kind of brings that recollection to mind. Okay, we're dealing with that house. We're dealing with that family. Other ideas, though. Why this terminology specifically? That we're going back a generation further. Because this isn't just saying son of David will do it, someone from the household of David. It's removing it a further step from the stem of Jesse. Well, kind of as we've already said, who is of Jesse, who is the branch that would come forth from that, is David himself. The reference with all of the others, the reference with all of Solomon or Jehoshaphat or Hezekiah or any of the other men who would come later, is always that when they did well, they walked in the ways of their father David. They're connected to David. They don't go back to Jesse. Now, they could, genetically. He's in their family. It's, again, just another generation back. But by describing him this way is not just to say he's another one of those. He's another one like all of the line of Davidic kings. But he is, in a sense, that original one. The son of Jesse is David. And so we're dealing with a second David. We're dealing with the culmination. We're dealing with the one that fulfills, that kind of completes that circle of typology there. Only David could properly be described as coming from Jesse, or is properly described in that way. The other ones are traced back to David. So the branch, this one who's coming forth, is the second David. So we're going to see that true thing coming again, God's promises coming to rest in a full sense. That here is David part 2. Here is David, the real, genuine thing that David himself even only gave us the foreshadowing of. But notice also throughout this passage, and we didn't read verse 10 yet, but take a look at the next verse after we stopped. And that day there shall be a root of Jesse, who shall stand as a banner to the people, for the Gentiles shall seek him, and his resting place shall be glorious. This is the verse actually that is quoted in the New Testament, quoted in Romans chapter 15 by Paul. Compare verse 10 and verse 1. A rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch growing out of his roots, his being Jesse's. And then in verse 10, in that day there will be a root of Jesse. Don't those describe an almost opposite relationship? Root and stem. In one place it's as though Jesse is the roots and everything else is growing out of it, kind of the visible part that you would see. And then in verse 10, it's a root. The one being discussed is himself the roots of Jesse. I think there is maybe an important connection or comparison between this kind of odd relationship and the original promise, the original messianic promise of Genesis 3. If you remember in Genesis 3, in that original case, the human family is preserved, seemingly preserved because the seed dwells within it. God speaking to the woman, your seed, or I guess in speaking, kind of addressing the serpent and Adam and Eve, between your seed and her seed, there will be enmity. But her seed, this one who ultimately will come, is going to crush your head even though you bruise his heel, etc. You're familiar with this prophecy in Genesis 3:15. So the coming one comes from human lineage, but human lineage continues so that he can be born and can conquer. That's sort of the purpose for the whole thing. But he is a descendant of that whole thing that leads up to him. And so, as one has described it, the branch is the root cause of his own family tree. It's almost a chicken and egg type scenario that, what happens first or what gave meaning to the other, well, it's all tied up in this one that's being discussed. He's a lineal descendant. He's younger. He's farther down the family tree, you might say, but he's the reason all of it exists in the first place. If you're talking about origin, if you're talking about genesis of something, he is why it's there. He's the root. He's the point, the purpose. But all these other things happen in anticipation of the day when ultimately he will spring forth and shoot forth. So both shoot and root are used here. Those are different things in a biological sense, but he can say of the Christ, it's clearly who we're dealing with here, but he can say of this descendant of Jesse that he is, in fact, both. There is a lot of mention as well in verse 2. Notice for a moment the Spirit of Jehovah. He assigns several things to the Spirit of the Lord resting upon him. What do we, what role especially think in the Old Testament, maybe especially think of David. David is given this endowment by the Spirit. But what role does the Spirit of the Lord serve? What does that accomplish when the Spirit of the Lord shows up? Because it might be different than we think of a lot of times with the activity of the Spirit. I think maybe Isaiah has a different landscape in mind, and his readers might have a different picture in mind when they're thinking about the Spirit of the Lord is going to do something, going to perform something. Ian? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sometimes we see people speaking forth, and kind of I don't know, Joel 2 would be another kind of prophecy that comes to mind, the idea of the Spirit of the Lord coming, and so your young men and your young women prophesy, and your people dream dreams, and the old men testify, and things such as this. You have knowledge that is being shared. And then you see, I guess in the reference to Elijah, and this would happen numerous times in the book of Judges, would happen numerous times with David and others like him, where the Spirit of the Lord comes upon someone and they act in a certain way. Spirit of the Lord comes upon Samson, and so he rips a lion in half. Spirit of the Lord comes upon Elijah, and so here he goes running. Spirit of the Lord comes upon David, and so here he goes into battle. And that usually is the significance there, that it is going to equip and empower someone chosen by God for a certain task. Again, I mean, you would say essentially the same thing if we're talking about the activity of the Spirit in the New Testament, but especially in this time, just sort of in this context, when the Spirit of the Lord is with someone, when the Spirit of the Lord overtakes someone and is upon them, then that man is going to be used by God to accomplish something. He's going to be outfitted with what he needs to take care of a set of tasks, whether that's fighting Philistines or speaking the words of truth to someone or doing whatever it is, leading men into battle. That's what the Spirit will equip you to do. And so that's essentially what we're being told here, that the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him. In what sense? A spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and might, the spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. So those are the things that this branch utilizes. Those are the things that he specializes in. And that covers a pretty wide depth, a pretty wide breadth of things. Yes, there's an emphasis maybe on knowledge, wisdom, understanding, knowledge and fear of the Lord, counsel, but also might, capability. He is going to perform what he is sent to do. He's going to do all things well. He is going to be in perfect obedience to the Father and is going to be able to accomplish what he's been sent to do so that it will be finished in the end. And so it bestows this ruler that we're talking about with certain attributes. So you have wisdom and understanding, the reservoir and outflow of godly knowledge. You have counsel, which might have military connotations, connected especially with might. He can use both strategy and prowess in battle. No enemy will be able to defeat him. He has the general ability, that knowledge and fear of the Lord. That's the ability to grasp and to apply truth to life, especially in view of God. That's the beginning of wisdom. So they have the particular utility, all these things together, of morality and worship and reverence and equipment to meet needs. So those gifts that are given by the Spirit of Jehovah in verse 2 are then accepted and directed by the branch in verses 3 through 5. So he has these God-given faculties, these divinely given, divinely infused capabilities and in accordance with that, has a character informed by the Spirit of God. And that's what's being described in those 3 verses, what that actually looks like, especially in those 3 main areas of wisdom and might and moral excellence. So he puts that into practice in his administration. And that's what's being described as a rule, how he's going to administer his government. That's what we read all the way back in chapter 7, this Emmanuel, the idea of him judging and the idea of him being the leader, the ruler of his people. We saw that followed through in chapter 9, the government being upon his shoulder, this great king. And so here is a continuation of that idea. How does he administer? Well, with justice and equity. He's able to perceive the reality that lies beyond or lies beneath appearance in verse 3. So he practices true justice, not by the sight of his eyes, not, I don't really like the look of this guy, or, ooh, look how, well-dressed or how well put together he is. He must be the one who's in the right. Not, this person's better looking. They have to be a good person. Well, no, he's not going to judge by that and just by hearsay. His delight is in the fear of the Lord, and he will with righteousness judge the poor. He will with equity decide for the meek or the humble of the earth. They're given fair treatment. Notice that this doesn't mean he arbitrarily or unfairly rules in favor of someone because they are poor, because they are humble, because they are the lowly of the earth, whatever it might be, but that all are given equal judgments, all are given impartiality. That's what the branch does. That's what he specializes in bringing true justice to his people. And the emphasis starts, I guess, in verse 4 on his mouth or his breath. That's kind of interesting imagery to find there. Striking the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. What is that? Untangle that imagery for me. What's the point of describing things in that way? With the breath of his mouth doing something, the rod of his mouth. Any of you have a rod of your mouth? You ever hit anybody with your mouth? Yeah, Steve?
Is it referring to the Word of God being our judge?
I think it is. I think it's a connection to what he says. It's a connection to his speech. And you see this imagery picked up really common in New Testament thought, especially the picture of the king in the book of Revelation has very similar terminology used. There, the king has a sword coming out of his mouth in the book of Revelation. And that's what he uses. He uses his mouth, or he uses his breath to smite the enemy, to slay the wicked, and to judge the nations. That's the process through which that happens. So what's his power to effect change? What's his power to govern his people, to show right from wrong, and to teach them the way to live, and to hold them to a standard is bound up in what he says. He's going to teach. He's going to instruct. It'll be through that process. Others there. Doug.
Still kind of along what Steve said, it's the word, but it's what is impressive, I guess, is the power of the word. It's a supernatural, nothing else above it. It's a really high power that can't be overcome. It is the ultimate power.
Absolutely. And that definitely in verse 4, I guess, is emphasized even just in that verse. Striking the earth or slaying the wicked with this word, with this speech, is showing its vitality, its power, its authority to be able to do that, and to still call it righteousness is the highest authority imaginable. But its capability is definitely highlighted there. Ian.
With that, the ease in which it's done. I'll say easier said than done. God says it, and
Yeah.
there's no in between. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, they're simultaneous, aren't they? And Isaiah will make a lot of that process, I guess, throughout his prophecy, later on talking about his word not returning to him void, is the idea of if I've said it, then it is as good as done. I mean, it is accomplished. If that were not enough, I guess the imagery continuing in verse 5 is continuing that idea that he isn't a figurehead or a mere symbol or all talk, but he's one who accomplishes. What is again, just kind of the feeling or the significance? If you're strapping your belt on, what's happening? You're getting ready. You're prepared. Your pants aren't going to fall down midway through the fight. You're not going to be without your armor. Your stuff's not going to be coming undone. I'm strapping on my belt. I'm girding up my loins for action. I'm getting ready. I'm going to go take care of business, right? You see someone kind of cinching up straps and tightening on and making sure that all the buckles are done and making sure that everything is fast and in place. He's not doing that so that he can go give a speech. He's doing that because he's going to go do something. He's going to go take care of things. He's jumping into action. And so that's the righteousness and faithfulness of the branch are an active sense. It isn't all talk. It's effective. He's one who accomplishes. So in this opening section, there are verses 1 through 5 especially, I guess. Notice this function of messianic prophecy as being generally descriptive of the nature and the ministry and the character of Jesus. This is written 700 years or so before Jesus is born, but it clearly anticipates him. Again, that's not all it does. Isaiah isn't writing only for people of 7 centuries after him. This has something to do with his day and age, but how amazing that it has something to do for people of a day and age 27 centuries afterward, because we see within these words a description of Jesus, a description of him and who he is. You can read this and say, yeah, I mean, that is how he acted. That is what his character was like, that he was filled with wisdom, but that he was filled with might, that he delighted in the fear of the Lord, that he did not judge by appearance, but saw true righteousness and justice and equity, that he spoke authoritatively, he spoke with great might, but that he also was active, that he went about the world doing good, as the apostles say of him in the book of Acts. From these descriptions, we easily see him fulfilling qualification and expectation in his life, and stating the importance of these themes for his people. What does he teach his people to do? Well, Jesus stresses so many times these exact same things: bringing righteousness for the poor and equity, fairness for the humble, delighting in the fear of the Lord, doing what is right, doing what is in accord with the fear of Jehovah, and acting in that way at all times. In addition, though, I want to point out, and maybe this highlights for us, I don't know, exactly what our need for this or our desire for this is, because maybe we feel it keenly, or should. You picture a king like this, a governing power that is like this. The things described in verses 1 through 5, really verses 1 through 9. I mean, incorporate all of the peaceful animal imagery into it as well. You have something that's very appealing. But in the basic sense, the idea of a ruler, a leader, who instructs in the ways of Jehovah, who treats all men with impartiality, who appeals to righteousness, the basic sense of right and wrong, of living cleanly before Jehovah, who has instructed us in all things good. Righteousness and faithfulness, reliability, steadfastness. And who lives in these ways and instructs his people to teach in these ways. To us, this sounds, I hope at least, it would sound to you as it does to me, great in large part because when has man ever known an administration like this? When has man ever known a time of true justice where people could actually receive fair treatment all the time, that the government can't be bought and sold, that the government doesn't work for someone else's interests that aren't mine, that don't align with what is actually good for me or what is actually good for the people. Well, this seems completely foreign to us. And I guess highlighting that, illustrating that, when Jesus came, when he acted in exactly this way, what was the response? What happened? He was killed. The actual rulers, the actual powers that be, the people who were actually in charge said, well, we got to stop this. We can't have this going on. Crucify him. What other response do we expect from a governing power that is corrupt and that is evil and that isn't focused on righteousness and justice? Well, yeah, they're threatened by this. They hate this. The darkness doesn't like the light, and so they try to snuff it out. They try to kill it. When Jesus comes, here are the two responses that you have to him. People who, I guess the two main responses, because you also have a sort of in-between that hasn't really decided where they are. But you have these two primary things. The people who truly yearn for the righteousness of God, and those who hunger and thirst for it, and those who are the meek and lowly, and those who are poor in spirit, and those who are the salt of the earth and the light of the world, those people who honestly desire God and all the things that attend to him, Jesus comes and they rejoice, and they celebrate, and there is singing, and there are hosannas, and they recognize the goodness of God, and they want to follow him, and they do so with their whole hearts. But that's sort of what the rabble does. That's what the sinners do. That's what the people who know they are sick do. That's what those who felt like they were far off want to do, is to come near to the Lord. But those of earthly power, those of earthly prominence and significance, are threatened by this and hate it and try to destroy it. Well, the same thing plays out today. We have to be very sure, we have to be very certain in our lives which of those camps we really are in, which of those we truly identify with, whether it is with worldly power or those who are interested in and delight in the fear of the Lord and seek after his righteousness. I don't know. I think the response we see of Jesus coming and doing exactly what he said he was going to do, or exactly what was said of him that he was going to do, that he would judge and rule and speak to his people in this way, and we see the response to that, hopefully is instructive to us about the way of the world in general. Would we be threatened by a government of this style, one that's focused on righteousness, the fear of God, true faithfulness, etc.? All right, comments, questions, anything up through verse 5 or so. I'm going to talk about 6 through 9 here in a second. Yeah, Steve.
You know, the example of these different animals coming together and laying down. To me, what that represents is a change in character. When Jesus comes and when his word comes, and the impact of his words take effect on people,
Yes.
have a change in character. And Christians are called to come out of the world. They're no longer to be like we used to be. We're different. We're a changed person. I think that's what these animals are trying to symbolize. Things that were once enemies can now live together peacefully.
I agree entirely. And I think one of the real strengths of this imagery and this scene that he's setting up is, and this isn't the primary purpose of the passage maybe, but you read a passage like that and maybe you say, kind of as I mentioned at the beginning, well, I mean, that's impossible. That's not ever going to happen, right? You're not going to see little kids sticking their hand in a hole where snakes are, and everybody's fine with that. Mom and dad don't care because that snake ain't going to hurt him. And you see prey animals and predators walking around, and they're all fine, and nobody's a threat, nobody's a danger. And in fact, the lion it's not even in the scope of possibility that he's going to be a threat, because he's now a grazing animal. It talks about these predatory carnivores are now grazing like oxen. They're just totally different. And we say, well, that's impossible. But a lot of people read the New Testament and read the character of a kingdom citizen You look in a passage, I guess, like Romans 12 or any other, kindly affectionate to one another and giving preference to one another and rejoicing in hope and blessing those who persecute you, blessing and not cursing, rejoicing with those who rejoice, repaying no one evil for evil, not setting your mind on high things, living at peace with all men, don't avenge yourselves, all these things. And I don't know, you read a lot of the places in the New Testament where you see the character we're called to, and a lot of people say the same thing about that they will of this animal imagery. They go, that's impossible. I can't live like that. No one, people can't do that. Tiger can't change his stripes. Lion can't change its eating habits. Snakes are always going to bite. You can't do anything different than that. And in the same way, you can't change people. You can't create a world where people aren't going to do evil to one another. But this is showing us that God can do that. He can affect change in someone's life. He can bring about that new character. He can remake the natural order of things. And I think ultimately, the idea, maybe it is happenstance. I mean, a lot of different animals are used, but especially in verse 8, that imagery of a snake not being dangerous anymore seems significant, seems intentional. Again, going back to Genesis, going back to the garden itself, what's the original primordial danger? Who's described in Revelation as that serpent of old, that ancient enemy, the very first one that ever got you into trouble, that ever brought death about, is that serpent. And now he's saying, well, yeah, you don't have to worry about him anymore. You don't have to be afraid of that. Why? Because this branch, because this root, because this coming one that the Lord has prepared and promised removes all of that danger. The outcome of his rule is that old hostilities are gone with such a thorough change that we could scarcely believe it. They changed things to the very nature, completely reversing what you might expect. So no one will be hurt or destroyed, verse 9 tells us, kind of summarizing all of this, because knowledge of the Lord reigns in a complete and fulfilling way. That's how any of that is possible. That's how any of that comes about. When men follow the way of the Lord, when men are filled with the knowledge of the Lord, this is the peace that results. This is the goodness that results. This is the restoration of God's intended natural order that results. He's not describing a literal utopia, heaven on earth kind of thing. He is telling us the way of people who walk in his kingdom, the way of people who submit to his rule, and the ultimate outcome of this new creation that he will bring about. All right. I think I'm running out of time there. I just got a bell rung on me, in fact. Gary, I'll let you have the last word.
Kind of bring this home. I want you to think about how it would be for us in this congregation. Were we under the old rule? Would we be friends? Would we be able to congregate together without strife? You look at what happened before the flood.
Yeah.
People were at each other's throats. So, that's in mankind, and that's what sin has brought into this world.
Yeah.
So, by the mere fact that we have the Word of God with us, that brings this unity together.
Hopefully we are seeing many evidences of that in our lives and in our relationships that we say, well, I've captured a little piece of that at least. All right. Thank you very much. As always, appreciate your time, and we'll look forward to the